So much fun. There is nothing better than fun snowball fights, building forts on snowy days, and that enjoy hot chocolate. And don't forget to dry yourself off in front of the fireplace. This memory brings me so much joy. Everything around you is a frosty glaze, making the world stand still while the snow falls gently. I feel like that moment is always peaceful with the world. But when the snow becomes more alive and stronger, something stirs inside me, like there is something out there watching me and waiting for me. Always restless. I don't think about anything. I guess you're busy with that, what the kids are doing these days outside or inside on my Game Boy Color or my new Nintendo 64 or something. Now that I'm an adult and have just finished my studies, a few events pop into my head from my childhood. These evoke a familiar feeling of unease and fear. Especially when it snows, I understand the contrast between the joy of winter silence and the fear before a blizzard. I don't. So I'm trying to sort through my thoughts and the events of that time to bring together things I've long forgotten about as a child. Skiing was one of my favorite things. Winter activities. As soon as the first snow falls, my best friend Michael and I always head to the biggest hill in our neighborhood. Michael and I have been best friends since kindergarten, became friends after we were both held back at lunch because we were killing them. There was table paint. This little rebellion instantly bonded us together, and we have been together ever since. The big hill is our meeting place because we are both the same distance from home. I called Michael at home, and most of the time his mother answered the phone. As usual, when our parents asked what we were doing, Michael and I agreed on a time to meet at Hollenberg. The hill is called that for a reason. It is not a Stellar's climb, but a hill with a gradual increase in slope, ideal for a long sled ride. However, the surface of the hill is often covered in ice, which makes it very difficult to reach the top. Sometimes Michael and I would slip and fall multiple times down the slope before we reached the top, but that was exactly what made it more interesting as we tried always competing. This eventually made the slippery ice surface a challenge we both reached. Theo tốt with Michael Adivin rớt xa hết óc mè, giơ tay lên và nhỏ giọt chiến thắng ở vị trí đầu tiên. Có lẽ bạn sẽ gặp may mắn hơn vào lần sau. Cả hai chúng tôi from Theo tốt óc Theo Huy Cao Sian Một TNT District. Our neighborhood was in the middle of a forest, and the houses were scattered between the trees. The sight was fascinating. Smoke rose slowly from the chimneys and hovered over the rooftops. I could see the top of my house, and also Michael's house was not far away. It was quiet around us. Michael and I were the only ones outside, while most people had made themselves comfortable in their houses to escape the cold weather. But we braved the cold and enjoyed the moment. After a short break, we were getting ready for the first sleigh ride of the day. Michael called out D-Z, but before he could finish counting, I jumped on my sleigh and sped down the hill. Behind me, I heard Michelle calling loudly, "You cheater, come back." He jumped on his own sleigh and tried to catch up, but he didn't succeed. When we got to the bottom, I couldn't go all the way down the hill because I reached the bottom just before the forest. Michael came shortly after and playfully pushed me because I had started earlier. I laughed about it, and we both went back up the hill to try again. After a few hours of sledding, the sun was slowly beginning to move over the horizon. Michael and I were standing at the top of the big hill, ready for our last run before we would go home for the day. The whole day, had we only used the main path on the front of the hill, Michael had enough of the same route and suggested for our last trip to take an alternative route. The side path was much steeper than the rounded main path, and it led directly into the forest at the bottom, so that you had to wind your way through the trees. I had always been afraid to take this path. The year before, one of our friends, Jay, had ridden down the slope but lost control and crashed into a tree and broke his arm. Since then, none of us had dared to use this slope again. Michael, however, was ready to take on the challenge and wanted to go to the next day into school to show off in front of his classmates. I was skeptical and not enthusiastic about the idea. We both inspected our sled, stood at the edge of the steep slope, and exchanged a look. Michael nodded and said, determined, "Let's do it." Without hesitation, Michael jumped on his sled and raced down the slope. I hesitated, but finally the urge to follow him overwhelmed me. I watched as Michael skillfully slid through the snow and dodged the trees before he disappeared into the forest. With a deep breath, I shook off my fear, slid over the edge, and raced down the slope. The descent was rapid. I dodged the trees, but suddenly I hit an unexpected snow barrier at the edge of the forest. My sled was thrown into the air, and I landed on the ground with a heavy thud. I lay there motionless for a moment. My face pressed into the snow and felt the icy cold on my cheeks. Slowly I sat up, brushed the snow off me, and checked to see if I was unhurt. Luckily I had stayed in one piece, but I felt dizzy. The forest around me was dark, The tall, evergreen trees cast long shadows. The last rays of sunlight of the day fell through the treetops and bathed them in an eerie orange darkness. I looked around and spotted my sled just a few meters away from me. Part of the plastic had broken off, which meant that the sled was now damaged. I sighed in frustration. A new sled would be necessary. I turned around to look for Michael, but he was nowhere to be seen. Fine then, I called out his name, but the silence of the forest was the only answer deep down. I thought he was trying to play a trick on me to get even for my head start that morning. I called out again, "Nice try, Michael. But this time you won't get me. And by the way, you owe me a new sled." But no answer came. I started walking deeper into the forest, calling his name over and over again. Finally, I spotted his sled, which was lying about 20 m away in the snow, completely intact, but there was no sign of Michael. At first, I thought he was just hiding to annoy me. Michael was known for making jokes, but usually he gave up quickly when the fun was over. I was starting to find the situation no longer funny and said to Michael, "Let's go home, it's getting dark." But as I said the words, I noticed a blurry structure in the distance that was hidden between the trees. It looked like a snow castle. My curiosity got the better of me, and I ran towards the mysterious structure to take a closer look. As I got closer and had a better view of it, I recognized Michael through one of the windows of the burr. I could see him. I called out his Armin, but he didn't seem to notice me. So I went to one of the doors of the snow castle from the outside. It looked like an ordinary, if well-made snow castle. But when I went in, I was amazed. The inside of the snow castle was amazingly detailed. The snow walls were engraved, which gave the feeling of being in a real house. Windows and panels were carved into the walls, and even snow furniture decorated the common area and a bedroom. It was unbelievable how much effort had been put into this construction. But why was it standing here in the middle of the forest, so good hidden? Maybe the kids next door had built it, but it seemed to be more than just an ordinary children's project. Michael was in one of the rooms of the castle and was looking at the furnishings, fascinated. I went up to him, grabbed him by the shoulder, and he shrank back in shock. "Man, you scare me to death," one called. "Michael, yes, right, man. Why did you run into the forest in the first place? You even left your sleigh behind." Man, Michel shook his head. "Sorry, man. Originally, I wanted to hide and chase you, but then I found this strange place here. It's unbelievable. Who would put so much time into a snow castle that will soon melt anyway? Oh, yes. And look at this." He pointed to an engraving on the back wall. It said, "It comes with the storm." "What does that mean?" I asked Michael. Grin, "No idea. Probably just older children trying to seem scary and cool." I nodded. "Yes, probably." I took another look out of one of the windows outside. I noticed that the sun had almost completely disappeared. The darkness of the night was spreading quickly, and the orange glow that had previously fallen through the forest had disappeared. "Let's go back," man said. "Michael, my mom will kill me if I'm not home after dark." "Mine too," I replied. We made our way to the exit of the snow castle, but when I reached the door, I was overcome by a shiver. For a moment, I stopped and listened to the icy breeze that blew through the forest. The feeling of being watched crept up my neck, but just as quickly it disappeared from my thoughts. The fear of my mother and her punishment was much more real. Michael and I ran out of the forest, said goodbye, and went our separate ways back to our houses at home. I leaned back in my chair and stretched my back and neck through the window in front of me. I could see the snow falling harder than before. I was glad to be warm. The crackling of the fireplace brought a familiar sound that helped me relax and collect my thoughts. How had I forgotten the events of that day? The strange experiences in the woods with Michael. They were so strange that they should have burned themselves into my memory. Why had I repressed these memories until recently? Maybe it was the time of year that brought these childhood memories back to the surface. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and became aware of the space around me. Outside, the wind howled, the cold pressed against the walls of my home, and I felt a strange mixture of calm and unease. I tried to remember the days of my youth. That time in the wooded neighborhood with my best friend Michael. Our life often revolved around the big hill, and a few days after our encountering the snow castle in the forest, another strange occurrence occurred. I was at Michael's house, and we spent the afternoon playing the new video game Resident Evil. For on his GameCube, Michael was lucky that his parents had recently given him the console for his birthday, while I was still stuck on my Nintendo 64. We played for hours, taking turns trying to beat the campaign. After countless attempts and failing at various tasks, we decided to take a break and get a snack. We went up to the kitchen from a basement. Michael's family always had a supply of snacks like bagel bites or pizza rolls. We raided his freezer, pulled out some pizza rolls, and put them in the microwave. Of course, the oven would have been better, but we were impatient and wanted to get back to the game quickly. Michael's kitchen was an open concept with a large sliding glass window that led Out to the forest behind his house, as we waited, my gaze fell outside. The snow was falling thicker, and I could see the trees rustling along the edge of the forest. I tried to get a better look to throw, but the light from the reflected in the glass, which made it difficult to see anything, probably just the wind, I thought, as the microwave beeped and signaled that our pizza rolls were ready. We took the snacks and made our way back to the basement Michael bit into one of the hot pizza rolls and screamed, "Ah, damn, that's hot, man." I laughed, "Man, you have to let them cool down." Michael grinned embarrassedly. I know. But I was hungry." As Michael turned off the light, my gaze fell once again to the sliding window. The snow was falling even thicker now, and the forks formed a hypnotic pattern that drew me in. For a moment, I looked towards the tree line wrapped in snow and the dark branches of the evergreen trees there on the edge of the forest. I thought I made out the outline of a large figure. The figure stood motionless and seemed as if it was looking directly at me. A strange feeling came over me, a mixture of paralysis and fear. It was as if the gaze of this figure was holding me trapped in time. "Come on, man," called Michael from the basement. "We have to complete this level, and the pizza rolls are now cooled down." His call tore me out of my trance. I looked out the window again, but the outline of the figure had disappeared. "That's strange," I mumbled, but tried to calm myself down. Probably just too many creepy video gamers. Without thinking about it any further, I went back to the basement. We played until late at night, ate our snacks, and had fun. But when she was on her way home later, the events of the evening were still haunting my mind. I remembered the figure at the edge of the forest and asked myself if I had just imagined it. Just before I left Michael's house, I stopped at the tree line, and there they were, footprints in the snow. A cold shiver ran through me. I suddenly felt like I was being watched, as if something was looking at me from the forest. It was a feeling that I couldn't shake off. I wanted to ignore the thought, but something was pulling me deeper into the forest towards the snow castle that we had discovered a few days before. It was as if it itself had a presence that wanted to lure me, but something inside me refused to go any further. A deep unease gripped me, and I made a sharp turn. I ran back towards my house, but the feeling of being followed didn't let go of me. It was as if an invisible hand was almost touching me just a few steps behind me, ready to pull me back into the forest. I just made it to my driveway, ran to the front door, and slammed it behind me. Breathless, I paused and looked out of the icy window. The snow was falling even thicker now, and the memories, all the events from my past, flooded into my head again. Those feelings, the fear, the anxiety, came back as vividly as if it had all happened yesterday. Since that day, my life had been mostly normal. There were strange occurrences here and there, but nothing that really caused any concern. Michael and I grew up attending different universities, but close enough that we could see each other occasionally. University was exciting, although many memories of the countless nights of partying and pranks have now faded before we really realized that we had graduated, took full-time jobs, and our lives started moving in different directions. Michael moved to the other side of the country, while I stayed only a few hours away from where I grew up. We tried to keep in touch, but as life goes, it became more and more difficult over time. I sat there staring out the window and watching the snow, which was now falling wildly and chaotically. Suddenly, I realized that I couldn't remember the last time I had spoken to Michael. Without thinking twice, I reached for my cell phone and dialed his number. On the second ring, a familiar voice answered. "Hey, what's up?" asked Michael. "Oh, not much, man. I just wanted to hear how you are. It feels like it's been ages since we last saw each other." "I know, sorry, man. Work really has a hold on me, and everything else comes along too. I always thought being an adult would be fun, but somehow the opposite is the case." I laughed. "That's right. And I think we always said we could stay up as late as we wanted. Now I'm usually up by 9 p.m. clock in bed." Michael agreed and added, "Exactly. Hey, do you remember that strange day when we were sledding and found that snow castle in the forest?" "Yes, of course, man," I said. "I'll never forget that day. That place was crazy. Whoever built it definitely had too much time. But to be honest, it always made me feel uncomfortable, especially that strange sentence that was carved into the wall." "Right," answered Michael. "What was that again?" "It's coming with the storm." "Yes, exactly. That it really unsettled me back then." Man, we continued talking about that time, and Michael admitted that winter always made him kind of restless. "I don't know what it is, but I've always had this SMMY feeling in the wintertime. My girlfriend thinks it's the spider, but some EDW is just different at this time of year." "Were you telling how long has it been since you were home?" I asked. "Oh man, not since high school. I guess I couldn't wait to get away from there and do my own thing." Michael told how his relationship with his parents had deteriorated when he got older. He had been happy to move out and build a life of his own. I understood him, but it had been a while for me too since I had been in our old neighborhood. That may sound crazy now, I finally said, but I think when I go home for Christmas, I will try to go back to this place and find the snow castle. Michael laughed. Do you think it is still there after all these years? Probably not, I admitted, but something inside me says I have to see it to believe it. Maybe it is just a nostalgic idea, but I am convinced that the place will be the same as it was back then. Michael remained silent for a moment before answering. If it is really still there, you owe me $100. Okay, deal, I said with a laugh, even though I knew the chances were vanishingly small. But deep inside, I felt that the place could still exist unchanged, as if frozen in time. The thought did not leave me alone. Even after the conversation was over, the Christmas wish to see the snow castle again felt like a crazy idea, a connection to a past that I had long buried. But a part of me knew I had to find out. I stood on top of the big hill and surveyed my old neighborhood just as it had on that fateful day. The chimneys were smoking and giving off that familiar soothing smell that took me back to my childhood. The snow was falling thickly, and the more time passed, the more violent the storm became. I played over the edge on the back of the hill. It was not nearly as steep as I remembered it. As a child, it seemed like a mountain, but now it was little more than a small slope. The wind and the snow whipped into my face, and I shivered. Finally, I reached the edge of the forest, happy to find shelter from the storm in the towering trees. Everything seemed so familiar to me, as if I were a child again, looking for a friend who had disappeared in the forest. I carefully walked deeper into the forest. An orange shimmer covered the forest and flashed between the pine trees. Unlike outside on the hill, it was quiet here. Not an animal could be heard, no rustling of branches in the wind. The silence was almost tangible. I continued step by step until I suddenly stopped. A strange feeling came over me, and deep inside, I knew what I was about to see in front of me was the snow castle. Just as I had left it all those years ago, I had hoped that it had disappeared, but it was unchanged. The snow covered it just like it had been back. Then I felt fear and doubt creeping up inside me. What had brought me here? Why couldn't I just turn around? But something was pulling me on. I approached the entrance to the castle, and again felt that oppressive feeling of being watched. I was not alone when I passed through the narrow doorway. I ducked, but inside the room opened up, and I could stand upright. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I gasped. The once pristine interior was now devastated and untidy. I went further into the next room, where the engraving was on the wall. But this time it was different. The only sentence, "It comes with the storm," had changed now. It said, "The storm has come." The engraving began to change from white to purple red as a voice rang out behind me. "I have you. Music, vermis only." Coldness crept up my neck. The presence that had drawn me here was now there. I was frozen, and my blood froze to ice. The voice continued, "I have watched you for a long time, following you, waiting for this moment. You thought you could forget me, but I have never forgotten you. The time has finally come." The storm outside had developed into a snowstorm, and the snow and the wind were penetrating the corridors of the castle. I could not move. A guttural sound rang out behind me, and I turned around. In the whirlwind of the snow, I saw the creature. Its limbs were long and thin, and its mouth was full of razor-sharp teeth. At that moment, I heard a voice come on. "We have to get out of here." It was Michael. He pulled me with him, and we ran out of the castle and into the forest. Behind us, we heard the screaming of the creature that was pursuing us. The snow whipped into our faces, but we kept running until we saw the edge of the forest. Suddenly, Michael stumbled over a fallen tree and fell to the ground. I pulled him up, but the creature was already behind us. It grabbed me by the collar and lifted me over its cave-like mouth. The creature's acidic breath made me gag in. I prepared myself for the worst, but then a flame shot towards the creature. Michael held a can of hairspray and a lighter and set the creature on fire. It let out a blood-curdling shriek, but we didn't wait to see what happened to it. We kept ranting until we reached Mike's old house in his parents' living room. We finally sat together, trying to calm our nerves. Michael said he had had a strange dream about the castle. Just before he came home, he knew I would try to find the castle, and had come just in time to save me. "Without you, I would be dead." I said, "I owe you my life." Many years later, my life had stabilized. I had a wonderful wife and 2 great children. On a snowy Christmas morning, my sons were playing outside in the snow. My youngest son, Nathaniel, came, and his cheeks red from the cold. "Hey, little one, where's your brother?" I asked. "You have to stay together when you're outside. Don't worry," he said. "We were just working on something amazing. You won't believe it. It's unbelievable." A strange feeling came over me. As I came out of I looked out the window. The snow began to fall thickly, and I could not shake off the familiar unease. Story 2. A rough snowstorm broke over our small village and swept across the vast countryside. It bounced and rumbled on the roofs as if it were passing over us like a threatening Christmas demon. At That moment I felt that the time of Christmas was coming over the country, and reaching all our dreams, the dark snowmen guarded the front gardens of our street, and seemed to be watching the children, playing exuberantly between the mountains of snow. They romped happily, and without a care in the world through the snow, engaged in lively, beautiful battles, and completely forgot about everyday life. Festively decorated fir trees stood in the living rooms of the houses, and their candles with red wax shone in the light of the mystical time the Christmas season was, and is a magical time that has always inspired people and made children's hearts beat faster. It conveyed a feeling of community and welcomed everyone into its warmth. I loved the Christmas season. Even as a child, I was looking forward to it all year round like an obsessed person. On Christmas Eve, often I could hardly wait until the fourth candle was burning in our Advent wreath. I was allowed to write my wish list and wish for everything that otherwise only existed in my dreams, whether it was the scent of the perfume that my mother only wore on Christmas Eve, or the sound of the bell that rang on time for the presents. I loved Christmas in all its facets. But as life goes on, the little boy became a grown man, and Christmas gradually lost its meaning. In many ways, it turned into illusion that shook my childish mind. I was particularly shocked by the realization that Santa Claus did not exist, and that my parents were behind all of his appearances. It felt as if a knife had been stabbed in my heart, and I still decided to make Christmas a magical celebration for my own children. Year after year, we invited the family and had rituals and stories that sweetened the anticipation of Santa Claus. I was a policeman in a small crime-ridden town, but I always managed to take Christmas off for me. There were no excuses. I had a responsibility to my family that I had to live up to, just like my parents had done for me. On the morning of December 24th, I was sitting at my desk as usual and working on files and reports. The smell of freshly ground coffee beans rose from my steaming cup into my nose. Next to my keyboard lurked a box of Christmas cookies that my wife Lisa had baked for me. A fat snowman grinned into the office from the window, and I rocked excitedly back and forth on my chair. Suddenly, the office door was suddenly thrown open. Small stones that had got stuck under her scratched across the floor and left marks in the sensitive laminate. My colleague Henry stood in the doorway, his dark brown eyes fixed on my happy mood. Henry was not tall, had thick blonde hair, and a striking face. Although he seemed timid and gloomy, I thought he had a soft core. That's always the way it is with people like that. Or our Santa Claus is happy again. Every year, I would say the family was aggressive towards me. Yes, you can say that out loud. But he knows me. I blossom every Christmas. The Christmas tree is decorated, the cookies are baked, and it's almost time to call it a day. I answered, beaming, and glanced at the silver wall clock. I stroked my thick beard and grinned at Henry. My head turned red with joy, and I felt the blood rushing through my veins. Well, then you can be happy that you're being given the night shift on Christmas Eve. Not Henry. Oh man, you don't know what goes on. They're drunk burglars, and then they run the end Christmas songs on a continuous loop. Honestly, I can't do anything with all this crap. His words filled the room with a dark, caustic mood. Dude, calm down. Christmas is beautiful. You only see everything negatively. Maybe you're just jealous that I have the day off and can leave straight away, I replied calmly, and let my boots crash to the floor. I took a big sip of coffee without taking my eyes off Henry. Andre was silent for a moment. Then he whispered, embarrassed, no, I'm just telling you how it is. He shifted restlessly from one foot to the other, and I could tell that he felt sorry for himself. I am sorry. Since I worked here, I knew that Henry had to do the night shift every Christmas. His son would have been happy to have a Christmas with his father. You know, Henry, I can see that you're missing something, man. Spend time with your son and your family. That's important, man, I said. Henry looked at me suspiciously. What do you mean? You know that I have to work? Yes, but I'll take over your shift today. Go home. Celebrate Christmas with your family and give your son a real Christmas miracle. I decided. As I spoke, I knew that I would regret this decision, but I didn't care. Christmas meant more than just having the day off. By now it had started to snow, and the snowflakes were laying like a thick, soft blanket over the green of the landscape. The fir trees had white crowns, and a snow hare darted past the window of the police station. You would really do that? I don't know if I'm the right person for something like that. Henry hesitated and let his gaze wander out of the window. What are you waiting for? Just use the opportunity, replied. I'll make it my love. I'll Lisa really explain everything, and Fabian, of course, he will be sad, but he will also understand. Believe me, you would do the same for me. Is Henry, and noticed his hesitation. Something, or rather someone, seemed to be stopping him from making a decision. Fear was reflected in his eyes. The tips of his hair trembled, and he nervously bit his blood-red lower lip. With one hand, he dug into his trouser pocket. With the other, he ran his hand through his thick hair. The tension was clearly visible in his facial expression until he suddenly made a decision. Okay, if you think that would be best for me, then I guess I'll listen to Santa Claus. I hope I can still call them later. I mean, wishing them a Merry Christmas is part of it. After all, Henry replied, embarrassed. Henry, don't worry, just go home. Look, I'm off work now too. I'll call Lisa right away. And you pack your things now, I said, determinedly pulled my cell phone out of my pocket and dialed Lisa's number. On the other end, there was an icy silence for a moment, interrupted only by a slight electronic noise. I knew I was going to break Lisa's heart from Fabian, not to mention, after a few seconds, she picked up and her familiar voice greeted me, so cheerfully that the pain became almost unbearable. Hi, darling, how is my policeman? Are you coming soon? It's almost 3 p.m. and Fabi is looking forward to seeing you, she said, full of anticipation. I'm sorry, darling, I whispered quietly into the receiver. I took over HR's shift. He's never home for Christmas, and I felt really sorry for the poor guy. So I offered to stay the night at the station so he could spend Christmas with his family. I held my breath and waited for her reaction to my surprise. Lisa remained completely calm and showed understanding. Honey, I think Fabian will be disappointed, but you are great alone that you are sacrificing your favorite holiday so that someone else can be happy. That's exactly what I love about you. You know it would be okay for you if we went to your parents instead. Even without you, I don't want to completely disappoint Fabian. He was so happy. Yes, go ahead, that's a good idea. I replied, you can call me later and tell me how many presents Santa brought to Grandma and Grandpa. I'll be fine with my cookies and my coffee. I'll be back with you on New Year's Eve, I promise. I'll take you at your word. My dear, no, just kidding. Have a nice evening. I love you. I love you too. My darling, you're the best. After I hung up, I only really realized that this would be my first Christmas at work. I wasn't sure what to do now. But one thing was certain. First, I had to put up the colorful fairy lights on the office ceiling and decorate the office a little to make the evening more beautiful with my experience. It didn't take me long to transform the guardhouse into a shiny little Christmas market. Proud of my work, I decided to send him a photo. Exactly at the moment I opened the camera on my phone, a call from Henry popped up on the display. Confused, I stared at the screen. I was surprised that he was thinking of me at that very moment. I picked up hesitantly. There was only a quiet electronic noise on the other end, accompanied by an eerie, barely perceptible breathing. Applause. Applause. My heart started to beat faster, and I felt the receiver slipping in my palm. Due to sweat, I stood unsteadily on wobbly knees, which almost gave way under the weight of the moment. The seconds passed. There was silence again. It was me or the person on the other end who spoke a word after what felt like an eternity. Suddenly a voice rang out that didn't sound like Henry and had a strange undertone. Good evening, Michelle. Before Christmas, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to fulfill my own Christmas wish. No one has ever done this surprise for me. How about if I give you a very special treat? Henry, who is there are you? That I asked, distrust in the receiver. No, Michael, Henry is no longer there is only Henry. Christmas wish. BS the clown. Henry wants to show you something. He said it with a sinister laugh. I realized that it had to be a bad joke. Annoyed, I dropped my pen on the table and replied sarcastically, listen, Santa Claus or Christmas clown, treat yourself and unwrap your presents. It is high time. Really, Henry, I'm glad that you can have fun and finally enjoy Christmas with your family. Lisa took it in a relaxed manner, by the way, so you don't have to worry. But before I could speak any further, the call was changed. The monotonous beeping came into my ear. Dude, what kind of guy? I mumbled, annoyed. What's wrong with him? Making such unfunny jokes, even though I took over the shift for him. Scumbag, why didn't you just stay at home and celebrate Christmas with your family? Why do you keep doing this to yourself? I whispered, disappointed. Levi, feeling dazed, I got up from my chair and walked a few laps around the office. Nothing happened. No calls apart from Henry's strange prank call. Nothing was happening today. Actually, I should have been happy about it, but time dragged on like an old piece of chewing gum. So I took my now cold coffee cup and took a sip to keep myself awake. I went to the window. It seemed bitterly cold outside, and massive icicles hung like daggers from the roof. Everything was dark, and apart from the snow, I couldn't see anything. I was just about to turn away when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Between the dark green fir trees stood a black silhouette and seemed to be watching me from a distance. I squinted my eyes, but it was difficult to see anything. The person was wearing a black and white clown costume. My breath caught as the figure suddenly stepped out of the shadows of the fir trees. The clown, true, had a broad, disgusting smile on his face and a big red hat that looked like Santa Claus's. Under the hat's straw blonde hair sparkled in the moonlight like yellow straws. In his left hand, he held a blood-red package that glowed eerily in the light of the full moon. With his right hand, the creature pointed directly at me. My body began to shake uncontrollably. What did this honor want from me? I felt the blood stagnate in my veins as I suddenly moved the figure clumsily towards me. Although I knew that I was safe in the police station, I held my service weapon tightly in my hand. Suddenly, there was 3 aggressive knocks on the front door. My body froze when I heard the clown's voice. It sounded like it was being scolded by chains and caused goosebumps to spread across my entire body. "Oh, Michelle, I have to find you. I brought you a present. You told me to have a nice Christmas." And so I did. I stood there petrified when I heard something push a key into the lock and turn it twice. Now, there was no turning back. This sick psychopath had to be Henry. He had a key to the station, and the comment about the Christmas wish suited him. But why did he want to do this to me? The front door slowly opened, and the clown entered the station. "Michelle, where are you?" he called, and his voice echoed through the long, dark corridors. His steps were heavy and sounded cold as they came down the stairwell and straight towards me. My whole body was shaking, and I held my weapon, shaking, aimed at the office entrance. In that moment, I was determined to shoot if necessary. The clown started whistling Christmas songs and singing songs that I knew from my childhood. Music. The steps got louder, and the creature was not far from my office. It stopped in front of the door. Then I heard a shrill host laugh that went through my heart and leg before it turned into a dark, demonic gasp. Laughter. The door was pushed open, and I stood directly opposite the clown. It was Henry. His face was marked by deep wrinkles, as if he had been fighting with someone, but what really made the blood run cold in my veins was his cruel, exaggerated, wide smile that stretched from one cheek to the other. "Oh, Michelle, I have brought you something, proof that I have fulfilled my most beautiful Christmas wish." "Thank you," he said and smiled as his blood-splattered incisors flashed. With a quick tug, Henry pulled the lid off the package. Inside lay the severed head of an older man. The skin was pale and cold. His gaze was starry and lifeless gray. Hair shimmered in the light of the moon, and Henry seemed to delight in the sight. "You have now seen my Christmas wish, Michael, and now I have decided to fulfill your Christmas wish too. Something that basically all of my colleagues in this stupid station have wished for me. I was always the annoying Henry, the crazy one, but you, Michael, you have always seen me as a good person. That's why you can witness this now. That's what I wished for." I couldn't believe what I saw when Henry suddenly pulled a fork out of his jacket pocket. The tips of the forks gleamed in the moonlight. He licked the smooth metal with his tongue before he stuck it into his own carotid artery. Dark red blood spurted from the wound and hit me in the face. I wanted to throw up, but I couldn't. Andre screamed in pain while I covered my ears and shouted at him to stop, but he gasped until he finally collapsed from my feet. He drew twice before he whispered with his last strength, "Thank you for letting me show you my Christmas miracle." I couldn't process what I had seen that night and had to give up my job as a police officer. The police found that the head that Henry had with him belonged to his own father. They found out that as a child, Henry was abused every Christmas by his father. What shocked me most was a letter that was found implanted in the head of the corpse. It was written in dark red ink, "The blood is father," and contained the following message: "Hello, Michael. Thank you for giving me the courage to step out of my comfort zone that night. I think that was the Christmas that your decision contributed the most to my salvation. Best wishes. Story 3. Henry." It's Christmas time, and the Apaches and the holidays are just as important here as anywhere else. However, Grandpa has kept me pretty on TRB for the last 5 days. On December 1st, I was still sleeping on the leftovers of the Thanksgiving turkey we had been eating all week when Grandpa shook me awake and said we had to get going. I tried to turn on my side and asked him to let me sleep a little longer, but he just shook me awake again and told me to get up and help him get the things from the attic. When I asked him what things, he looked at me in shock. "The Christmas decorations. We need to make sure everything is ready for the season." Grandpa has always been crazy about the Christmas season. I can remember visiting my grandparents during the holidays and smelling the aromas of the season: gingerbread, sugar cookies, Grandma's traditional fruitcakes that she usually gave away and which tasted better than anything from the shop, and the scent of homemade cinnamon in the apple wine Grandma baked from November 22nd to January 5th. And in our house, there was always a cake, cookies, or other sweets that she had conjured up for the season. And while Grandma baked, Grandfather decorated. As we were setting everything up, I realized what a Herculean task Grandfather had to accomplish every year to make the house look as solid as possible. A railing was stretched across every roof. The mistletoe hung in whole bunches. Lights flashed merrily, and everywhere the sound of singing Christmas bells could be heard, as well as the silent wooden Christmas decorations to be seen. Some of my friends have asked me what Grandpa does to pass the time, and I can say that he is one of the best wood craftsmen in the valley. He makes furniture, walking sticks, and many other items that he usually sells at the Flume Market, especially at this time of year. Even the most jaded children's eyes light up at the sight of a bear or a wolf that Grandpa had carved out of a pine tree, spruce, or maple block, and many of the elaborate decorations looked very homey amidst the singing horde of Walmart abominations. After a week of putting up plastic churches, hanging Christmas lights, and nailing them around the house, I felt tired and a little uncomprehending. I had already imagined that on January 1st I would have to take this crap down and help it to be put away again. Grandpa had half the Christmas section of Walmart and a quarter of the Holy Jolie section of the local. I had plundered the hardware store. I knew it would take weeks to put everything back in its place, and the thought of it was already making me irritable. Anyway, I was just hanging stockings over the fireplace when I heard the loud chirping of a cricket. I winced a little, as I had not expected the insect to suddenly invade, because I hadn't heard a cricket since the cold front a few weeks ago. It was also a large specimen. Her body was coal black, and her legs were long and twisted. She could be heard again, hopped a little closer to the crackling fire, and I slowly reached for the magazine that was lying on the side table. This lady had hidden herself under the decorations. When my hand met resistance, I looked back and saw that Grandpa had grabbed the end of my magazine. "Don't do that, boy. That could be the worst mistake of your life." I gave him a strange look. "But relax my arm. Sounds like you have experience with such things, Grandpa," I said, and wanted Grandpa to help him with the tree while he prepared to tell another of his stories. Grandpa reached out a hand to the cricket and seemed to come to him as if it knew him. This was the worst month of my life, that's for sure. He placed the cricket on the shoulder of his button-down shirt and began his story with his usual flan. It was the night after Thanksgiving, and no one in our house was sleeping because there was a cricket wandering around. The cricket woke us up every night for 2 weeks. No one knew where it came from that year. The snow had come early in the mountains, and there was never a time after Halloween when there wasn't at least a couple of inches of snow on the ground. A blizzard was coming, and the old hands were predicting several feet of snow for Christmas. 2 of my cousins, John and Matthew, were staying with us for the foreseeable future. Their parents were up north and trapped by a sudden blizzard. They had sent a letter with some money and asked us to look after them until they could come back. We were happy to do so. Unlike Log, they were good company. We were all about the same age, toe or so, and spent our days in the yard making snowmen, building, having snowball fights, and sledding. It could have been one of the best Christmases of my life if it hadn't been for the cricket and what it brought with it. The cricket lived for 2 very good reasons. The first being that, as everyone in the Apaches knew, a cricket on the stove brings good luck, especially at Christmas time. My grandmother said that, and my mother and father, who were not normally superstitious, said it too, even though they woke us up with their chirping. My parents refused to kill them. They always held on to the idea that the cricket was lucky, but I suspected there was another side to the coin. The other reason was just as simple. We couldn't find it. We suspected it was in the chimney, but the heat from our fireplace didn't seem to bother it. My parents assumed it was in a crack in the brickwork, and that was why its chirping was so loud. Its chirping vibrated down the chimney and through the whole house, so we were all suffering from its noise. Then one day, I guess I'd finally had enough. It was late in the middle of the night, and the cricket had been chirping every hour, a single loud chirp that would slash through my consciousness like a razor and wake me up with a shudder. After 7 or 8 days, I got nervous, and the lack of real sleep was starting to make us all a little irritable. No matter how many pillows you put over your head, how tightly you stuffed your ears, or whatever you did to block it out, the sound would vibrate in your eardrums and shake you awake. With a jolt of clarity, I had gotten up to drink some water when I finally saw the little dung toad. I went into the kitchen. When I heard it chirping, then I turned around to look at the crackling fire and saw a tiny figure dancing in the background. It just sat there warming itself and singing happily. I reached for the fly swatter on the counter and knew that I would end its reign of terror. But then I heard my grandmother's voice whispering to me that I shouldn't do it, but my mind weakened by lack of sleep. Only wanted one thing. I wanted rest, I wanted peace, and most of all, I wanted to sleep. The cricket looked up at me, as if to ask me if it could help me. Its body grumbled as I brought the swatter down on it, and for a moment, I just basked in the sudden silence. As I went back to bed, the silence was not to last long. However, I had barely climbed back into bed, snuggled up, and got ready for sleep. I heard it again, the early chirping of a cricket. My eyes shot open, and I looked around my room for the source of the noise. The room was empty. Only the shadows of the moon reflected in my toys' clothes and other objects lying around were visible. The chirping had always sounded very close, as if it was in the room with me. but now it was so loud that I could hardly bear it. I was just about to crouch down because I thought I was just imagining it all when I saw a small black figure jumping closer to the bed. It was clearly visible its feelers moved excitedly back and forth, and its shape was unmistakable. I covered my head with me pillow and buried myself under the blankets and covers I had piled up on my bed to keep myself warm. They did little to stop me from shivering as I huddled under them, unsure of what to do next. It was following me. Was it a ghost? I had left the cricket as a stain on the stones. I didn't know what to make of this new cricket, but its presence had definitely frightened me. As it crawled around under the covers, I flinched and crawled backwards. To put some distance between us, I felt something on my face. Its pinching feet crawled over my lips, ND cheeks, and I put my hands over my face to wipe them away. However, my searching hand always seemed to be one step ahead, and when it felt the legs touch my ear, I hit the side of my head so hard it rang in my ears. Despite the ringing in my ears, I still felt the cricket slip into my head, and my horror made me shudder silently. I felt the tears stream from my eyes as the sharp chirping of the cricket came straight from my ear and sounded huge and deafening. I couldn't sleep that night. I was too busy listening to the cricket as it chirped in my head. I woke up dazed and scared, not sure if it was all just a dream creature or if any of it had actually happened. Then I stuck my finger in my ear and rushed around, not feeling anything. The chirping had disappeared, and when it got light, I could believe it had all been just a dream. I could hear people in the living room talking quietly to each other, and I rolled out of bed ready for another day of fun. My cousins were already up when I walked into the living room. They were sipping cups of heavily watered-down coffee and looking at the snow falling. As I saw the fresh powder falling, I flinched as a sudden loud, sifting sound penetrated my eardrums. I was about to hyperventilate as I had to come to terms with the fact that it had actually been real. I felt like my eyes were going to pop out of my head, and I took a step back, scratching my ears. "What's wrong with you?" asked John, looking at me strangely. Cricket gasped. I put a finger in my ear and shook it. I felt nothing, and nothing came out. But I knew what I had heard. "I know, isn't that great?" asked Matthew. "That was the first night I've slept well all week. I didn't hear that little crap 6 all night." "Yeah, me neither," agreed John, and they clinked their glasses ceremoniously. I was glad they'd slept well, but it seemed like my problems were just beginning. The snow was falling and piled up so high it covered Daddy's truck, and Mom was worried they would soon be snowed, and we had stocked up on lots of supplies. But with 5 of us living there 24/7, the supplies would probably only last a few weeks. However, we were still kids, and while my parents were worrying about the supplies, we played in the snow. I had hoped the cold would scare the cricket away and maybe even lure it out, but I didn't feel it move all day. What I did notice was its deafening whistling at random times of the day. Later, when it came inside, I had developed a slight twitch from the cricket's sudden and predictable chirping. As the day went on, my mom became concerned about the nervous twitching way I was starting to act. The seething was like an ice pick in my head, and I knew I wouldn't get a wink of sleep that night because of the lamb. Later, when she lay awake hearing a few crickets chirping at irregular intervals, I remembered of the chirping of crickets in the living room as a happy memory. The next week was a bit of a blur. I lived in a state of constant pain, and I don't think I slept for more than a few minutes at a time. Sometimes the thing chirped incessantly and made my head ring like the inside of a bell. Sometimes it fooled me into feeling safe by not chirping for hours, only to chirp loudly when I was just about to fall asleep. Sometimes it sounded like a single cricket, and sometimes it sounded like a whole black cricket jumping and chirping in my head. By the end of that first week, I was ready for the club mill and was afraid my life would never be the same again. Luckily, Grandma came through. After days in a row, the snow was halfway up the windows. It had been snowing steadily, and a real snowstorm was brewing outside. We all had to stay inside while my dad tried to keep the front door clear, and my cousins ate or played with toys while I slowly went mad. I sat in the corner. The twitches became worse by the day, and everyone had started to avoid me. I had deteriorated mentally since the cricket had entered my ear and had become a prisoner in my own body. I was shaking, making strange noises. I would sometimes wet my pants and seem to cry incessantly. I had once seen a child at school having fits, and he had been sitting in the back and twitching in the same way. I remember being afraid I would be like this forever, and I also remember praying to God to help me get this cricket out of my head. As in response, the door flew open, and my grandma came in with a bundle of firewood under each arm. Grandma had come from her house too. Ours, and no one knew exactly how she managed with 2 big piles of firewood. Mom had my cousin take the firewood and put Grandma by the fire She didn't see me right away, but her eyes got big and worried when she looked at me. She didn't say anything, but she came into my room after my parents and cousin went to bed that night to talk to me. "What did you do, Minion?" she asked as I laid in bed. I turned my teary eyes shut and stuttered out the whole story. I told her about the cricket, the constant chirping of the erosion of my mental state, and she nodded. I explained through the chirping explosions of the house guest in my head, and she seemed ready to cry with me. Every time I twitched, she picked it all up, and when I was done, she stood up and said she needed a few things from her house. "It'll be a while before I get the things I need, but I think I can lift this curse from you. Stay strong, Minion. I'll be back as soon as I can." Over the next 3 days, I ate and slept. Not me. Mom bothered me and tried to talk me into eating. Dad thought I had cabin fever and told her to just wait and see if I came to my senses. My cousins were curious, but eventually they got tired of watching me lying on my bed and slobbering all over my duvet and my head. The crickets were the only things that kept me company. Their chirping became less and less regular. Over time, Mom changed my clothes when I fell asleep, but eventually just left me lying naked with my towel under me. I don't remember much from those days. Mom was worried about my grandmother too. She just went out into the snow without a word. What happens if she freezes to death out there? "Don't worry, my darling," said my dad. "Mom has lived on that mountain for a long time. She knows how to come and go without making a fuss." I hope so. I could see he was right. Grandma couldn't worship in the mountains after all. I had seen her navigate those hills with ease in all seasons. The idea that she could worship was ridiculous at best, but the idea that a cricket could worship the idea that a ghost could be possessed seemed silly to me. A few weeks ago too. Then sometime in the early hours of the 4th day, I looked up, and there she was. She picked me up as light as a rag doll and carried me through the dark house. The floorboards creaked sleepily, and the snow was softly outlined on the windows. I could hear the sounds of my family snoring around us, and if they heard us, they didn't move. She took me into the bathroom, locked the door, and sat me in the heavy bath that had been this wedding present for Mom all those years ago. Seago's cold, fresh water in, opened her bag, and I felt my skin turn goosebumps as I lay there in the semi-warmth. "Just be still and don't interrupt me," she said, and poured a packet of dried something into it. She sprinkled me with dust, herbs, ointments, and even something that stung my eyes and made my skin tingle. She sang as she did so, and I could see the flickering of the flames as she spoke in her grandmother's language, as she called it. She spoke something long and musical, something deep and winding, and as I felt a twitch in my ear, I sucked in a harsh breath. It felt like someone was pulling steel wool out of my head, and I gritted my teeth as I waited for it to be over. Suddenly, I heard a loud splash as it fell into the tub. I turned my head to see what had happened, but she hissed at me. I asked, "Be still." She probably knew what was coming next, but I was not prepared for the sudden splash. My ears began to hum, and my body felt like it was going to burst. I could hear the chirping of 1,000 different crickets and felt them pour out and fill the tub. Their feet and antennae scratched at my ears. Their shrill cries made me scream too, and as they fell into the water, I heard them crying in pain as they drowned. My grandmother suddenly pulled me out and held me tightly to her while the sounds of the insects dying got louder and louder. When it finally stopped, we cried together, and my ears were mercifully quiet. I looked at my grandpa. The firelight sparkled in his eyes as he came to from his dream of the old Christmas time. "So did Grandma heal you, Grandpa?" I asked. "Well, kind of. Since then, I've had a constant ringing in my ear, but the buzzing was actually gone. A few days later, I was back to my old self, although for about a week after she lifted the curse from me, I could swear I heard the phantom crickets. My eyes got a little big while so I cursed the cricket." Grandfather nodded. That was all grandmother could find out. The little animal had been killed unnecessarily, and instead of bringing good luck, had cast a curse instead. Grandmother said I was lucky that it had come by. The crickets in my head had become too much at some point, and I would probably have died or gone crazy. I looked back at the cricket and now showed a bit more respect. "Hey, listen, what are you doing to my grandpa?" Then my grandfather told me to follow him, and he took me back to his room. In his bathroom, wrapped in a towel to keep the cold out, was a small wire cage in which there were about 5 or 6 slow crickets. They were nibbling on potato slices, drank water from a bowl, and hopped on the spiders on the floor of the cage. Grandpa put his new friend in the cage and smiled at me as he closed the little door. "I will take them to the forest when it gets warm. Those that survive the winter, I always release them in the spring so they can bring good luck to others next winter." I hugged him then and was happy that he had saved me from something similar to his own fate, and he patted me happily on the shoulder. "Now come on," he said after listening to the crickets adorning their cage for a few minutes. "We must prepare this place for Santa Claus. I have met him once. Have I told you this before?" And as we went back to decorating, he told me about a night in Alaska where he had actually met the jolly old man himself. all of us in Grandpa's cabin deep in the mountains wish the bad guys out there a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. May the crickets bite